250 Starbucks locations have petitioned to form unions. The first Amazon warehouse has voted to unionize. A small office of Google employees in Kansas City became the first to organize under the new Alphabet Employee Union. And across the country, service industry workers have been pushing, with varied levels of success, to form unions to protect their basic workplace rights. How has the pandemic changed the face of labor organizing? What laws control how employers can treat unionizing employees? And what can you do if you feel that your workplace rights have been violated? Let's unpack what's happening with unions in the United States. A Gallup poll last month found that 71% of Americans support unions, which is the highest level of support for unions since 1965, during the height of the civil rights movement. And if anyone has a TikTok and is on the labor organizing side of it, like I am, you'll understand why. People kind of got radicalized over the pandemic. They got a slice of what it might be like to not show up to an office every single day. They had the time, because they were either laid off or no one was going out, to sit and contemplate what they actually care about and what's important to them. It's interesting how global trauma will do that to a person. And I think people are realizing the importance of, or the important role that labor plays in our lives, and that there are options other than just being beholden to whatever company works for you. Thank you to Scentbird for partnering with me on today's video. I tend to get stuck in scent ruts, and Scentbird helps me try new scents and discover ones that I never knew I would like. They come in these little bags, and then in these little vials. And they each hold quite a bit of perfume, a month's worth at least. And they're great for traveling with. I took them with me to Ireland recently and it worked great. Scentbird allows you to discover what scents work for you by taking a simple quiz and being matched with scents based on your preferences. And you get to choose a new designer fragrance to try every month for just 15 bucks per month, so you'll never get bored. And there are tons of options to choose from. And each month you get one of these cute little cards that tells you all about the fragrance and the various notes in the fragrance. I've been loving the Solar Aura scent. It's got hints of blood orange, ylang ylang, and a little musk. Beautiful. Wear it on a fancy night out. Also, I've been loving this Hermetica by Source One. Look at that bottle. It's beautiful. And it smells amazing. Bergamot essence, dry amber, fresh wood. It's like so good. Woodsy and delicious. But also that citrus note gives it just a little bit of a dink. You know what I mean? Versace Bright Crystal, not a scent I would typically go for because it's got peony, yuzu, pomegranate, lotus, but it also has a little musk. And turns out I love it because I love musky and I usually go for woodsy scents, but this one is really fresh and springy. And I know we're going into fall, but sometimes the dark, dark days of winter require a springy scent. So I'm looking forward to using it then. Then we got Bella by Vince Camuto. This smells like a man in the best way. Nectarine, jasmine, amber, and bergamot, but it's spicy. It's good. This is perfect for fall. Be sure to use my code Leeja at Scentbird to get 55% off your first month. That's just over $7 for your first month. Available in both the United States and Canada. Thanks a lot to Scentbird for partnering with me, and check out their links below. But let's just start with the basics first. What is a union? A union is an association of workers formed to protect their rights and advance their interests. Power in numbers, baby. Unions are organized and have experienced negotiators on their teams to help advocate for workers' rights. Unions then negotiate with employers through a process that's called collective bargaining, which results in a contract that specifies the workers' pay, hours, benefits, health and safety policies, etc., etc. It's basically a way for workers to band together and push for their rights, because otherwise companies often don't really care about workers' rights because the bottom line always takes precedence. Let's look at the history of unions in the United States to figure out how we ended up where we are today. Turns out unions have existed in the United States since the very beginning of the country. The first recorded workers' strike is from 1768, when tailors protested a wage reduction. In 1794, shoemakers in Philadelphia formed a union called the Federal Society of Journeymen Cordwainers. And from there, unions proliferated throughout the United States, especially due to increased industrialization, which put workers in large factories together and put multiple different trades under one roof. creating alliances amongst the unions. Many of the largest, most powerful unions were, of course, mainly made up of white Protestant males who had funds to pay union dues, and of course these excluded not only women and black workers, but also even Irish and Italian immigrants. Those groups, however, organized their own unions. For example, in 1834, the Mill Girls in Lowell, Massachusetts protested wage cuts. In 1835, black workers in the shipbuilding industry held a strike at the Washington Navy Yard. Women tailors, shoebinders, mill workers, and black laundresses also formed their own unions. And in 1867, the National Union for Cigar Makers was the first to accept women and black workers. In 1843, the Lowell Female Labor Reform Association began petitioning for 10-hour workdays. 10-hour workdays was the improvement that they were seeking. In 1909, the uprising of the 20,000 was a protest by female shirtwaist makers in New York. 2 years later, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire killed 150 workers. It's thanks to union activity that certain rights for all workers and even citizens remain a part of the social fabric of how we labor today, like the 8-hour workday, which, as much as it feels like no human should work for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, it's still better than the 12-hour manual labor workdays that a lot of people were doing at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. In our last video, we talked about Eugene V. Debs, who ran for president from prison after being convicted under the Espionage Act. Sound familiar? Check out that video after this video, okay? He organized a strike of Pullman Railroad workers. Sound familiar? In 1894, which was the largest labor movement in U.S. history. In 1881, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions was formed, and 5 years later, the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, was formed. Through the organized effort of the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions and the AFL, an act of Congress in 1913 created the Department of Labor. The Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 allowed employees to strike and boycott their employers, and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 mandated a minimum wage, extra pay for overtime work, and basic child labor laws. And labor organizers at the AFL continued to play a crucial role, including in helping to pass civil rights legislation in 1964 and 65. Basically, a look at the history of labor unions tracks with the history of war and social unrest and instability in this country. For example, during the Roaring 20s, unions lost some influence. Then the Great Depression hit, and workers started turning to their local trade unions to find employment and protection. During World War II, labor unions and interest in them cooled, and some unions, including those in the defense industry, were forbidden by the government to strike because of the impediment it would present to wartime production. Then, during the Red Scare of the 40s and 50s, there was a huge pushback against unions, as some of the founding trade unionists were socialists and communists and anarchists looking for revolutionary change. The Taft-Hartley Act in 1947 required all union officials to file an affidavit and take an oath saying that they were not communists. Then the civil rights movement in the 1960s mobilized many, including members of the Black and Latino workforce. This included a 46-day strike at 7 of New York's most prestigious hospitals, which ended with the workers winning union recognition and better pay and working conditions. This was again seen in the 90s via nursing home and home care worker unionization. Also in the 60s, Filipino and Mexican American farm workers, led by Philip Vera Cruz, organized a grape boycott. After 5 years, grape growers finally came to the table to sign the first union contract, granting better pay benefits and protections to the workers. That being said, agriculture workers to this day still have a very low rate of union organization, probably due to the fact that many of them are immigrants, many of whom aren't really interested in signing their names on lists and getting wrapped up in the law. You know what I mean? And in 2008, unions were instrumental in President Barack Obama's election, with union membership decreasing then during Obama's administration, in part because Obama ran on a promise of increased worker protections that never came to fruition. This led some unions to switch their support to Trump during the 2016 presidential election, because he is somehow seen as more of the people than the Democratic Party, which is wild because I can't think of a more entrenched elitist than Donald Trump. But I also can't blame people for not seeing working class rights as being very high up on the list of things that are important to Democratic politicians either. Looking at you, Nancy Pelosi, and every other multi-millionaire sitting in our Congress. And today the highest rates of union membership are public sector employees, specifically in local government, which covers police officers, firefighters, and teachers. And then in the private sector, high unionization rates are mostly in the utilities, motion pictures and sound recording, transportation, and warehousing. And while there has been a gradual decline in membership rates over the last few decades, there seems to be a growing interest in union organizing now post-pandemic, which, like I already talked about, is not surprising given the fact that the pandemic laid bare the extreme wealth inequalities in this country, with Jeff Bezos sending a rocket into space while people everywhere are just struggling to make ends meet, while also suffering the extreme mental health effects of being quarantined for 2+ years. Interestingly, in 2021, non-union workers had median weekly earnings of $975, while union members had weekly average earnings of $1,169. A $194 difference. And this chart shows a correlation over the last 100 years between union membership and the share of income going to the top 10%. Notice that when union membership was highest in the 40s and 50s, the share of income going to the top 10% of earners was the lowest, and it has steadily risen at about the same rate as union membership has dropped. This is, of course, correlation, unclear if also causation. And of course, this isn't to say that there are zero drawbacks of unionization. For example, there are union dues that must be paid by members, which then go towards the salaries of union leaders, as well as towards union workers during strike, with some reports of unions spending these dues on 6-figure salaries for leaders and over-the-top headquarters. Unionization can also lead to workplace tension and less individual autonomy for workers. Putting the collective good over individual autonomy is not really ingrained in US culture. You know what I mean? But since the pandemic, there's been a growth in unionizing efforts, most visibly at Amazon, Starbucks, and Apple stores. But how does this all even work? How do these workplaces unionize? Well, I'm so glad you asked. So basically what happens is employees start talking to each other and they say, hey, we could make things better, right? And then someone who's an employee talks to a union organizer from a relevant union. Then they start a committee of fellow employees with the help of the union organizers. They build an organizing committee, which is a key group of leaders at the workplace who feel strongly about needing to organize. Then they work together to get more coworkers involved with the effort to win a union contract. Reminder that you do have the right to talk to your coworkers about starting a union and about workplace conditions, including pay. That is your right. After that, you then need to get a majority of your coworkers to agree on the need to have a union, and then you sign support cards. These cards declare that you want to start a union and have whatever union it is that you've chosen as your partner. Once the majority of your coworkers have signed union support cards, then you hold a vote. You submit those union support cards to the National Labor Relations Board and request a union election, which can take many weeks as the board decides on the date and determines who at your workplace can vote, etc. Then, when the election is held, if the majority of the coworkers vote yes at your election, your employer now has to recognize your union and bargain with you and your coworkers via union representatives and negotiators. Then the union that you've organized with will get to work negotiating the first union contract. Once that contract is won, you then obtain a membership with whatever union you've chosen. Cool. And at least in Minneapolis, I've noticed within the food service industry a lot of unionizing activity like this. Some successful and some less successful. Which got me wondering, what are companies and employers allowed to do when their employees are trying to unionize? Because I've seen some shady behavior. So let's look at the law, shall we? The National Labor Relations Act, or NLRA, was passed in 1935. It's a federal law that protects employees in private sector workplaces by giving them fundamental rights to seek better working conditions, union representation, collective bargaining, and full freedom of association without fear of retaliation. This act also created the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, which investigates anti-union behavior and other violations of the NLRA. According to the NLRB, examples of employer conduct that violates the law includes the following: threatening employees with loss of jobs or benefits if they join or vote for a union or engage in union activity, threatening to close the plant or place of employment if employees start a union to represent themselves, questioning employees about their union sympathies or activities in a way that interferes with, restrains, or coerces the employees in their exercise of their rights under the NLRA, promising benefits to employees for discouraging union support, transferring, laying off, terminating, assigning employees more difficult work tasks, or otherwise punishing employees because they engage in union activity, basically quiet firing, or quiet firing employees because they filed unfair labor practices charges or participated in an investigation conducted by the NLRB. Basically, the NLRA bars employers from interfering with union activities. However, the NLRA also prohibits certain activities by labor organizers and employees. For example, labor organizers, unions, can't threaten employees that they will lose their jobs unless they support the union, or punish employees for not being union members, or refusing to process grievances from employees who have criticized union officials, or otherwise discriminate against non-union employees or retaliate against them. Also, no engaging in picket line misconduct like threatening, assaulting, or barring non-strikers from the employer's premises, or striking over issues unrelated to employment terms and conditions. The NLRB oversees all of that and processes complaints related to workplace misconduct involving union activity. Now that all sounds fine and dandy, and in theory you should be able to do all of that freely in your workplace. The problem, however, is that list of employer conduct that violates the law. You see, it's really easy for employers to point to other reasons for their actions. Because even if their actions have the consequence of barring union activities, if they can point to a justifiable reason that's not related to busting unions, then it's really hard to bring a case against them saying that they violated the NLRA. This is similar to the video I made a very long time ago about worker rights in relation to the 𝗏𝗏𝗡𝗡𝗏𝗦 saga, which at the time it was facing a lot of internal discrimination complaints. Similarly to workplace discrimination, bringing a union busting case against your employer can be a very difficult uphill battle. And even with these union protection laws, there are companies engaged in what some people, not me for legal reasons, are saying is pretty blatant union busting behavior. For example, at Starbucks, more than 250 locations have elected Starbucks Workers United as their bargaining representative, with Starbucks leadership staunchly opposing this unionization. Bloomberg reported that the Starbucks CEO has made anti-union comments that quote-unquote straddle the line of legality. For example, in an interview, the CEO of Starbucks said the company needed to reinvent the role and responsibility of Starbucks and customize new benefits to demonstrate to our people that they can trust us. And then the interviewer asked, could you ever see doing that and embracing the union as part of it? To which the CEO responded, no. The customer experience will be significantly challenged if a third party is integrated into our business. The NLRB has received almost 200 charges accusing Starbucks of violating federal labor law in the last year, and prosecutors have issued 8 complaints, including about 50 total charges related to the activities of Starbucks during the union wave, including one case that accuses the company's North American president of unfair labor practices. In that same interview, Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, essentially said he won't work with the union. It is a violation of the NLRA when an employer suggests that joining a union could be futile because they won't work with it. They won't negotiate with the union. And of course, a comment alone isn't enough to bring a complaint, but it could be indicative of the inside activities within Starbucks and of violations of labor laws. Elsewhere in labor organization efforts, anecdotally, I have seen people on TikTok and Instagram in Minneapolis and elsewhere complaining that they were fired or treated poorly by their jobs after trying to organize a union. Here in Minneapolis, there is a brewery that will remain unnamed where the employees tried to organize, and then the brewery swiftly shut their doors and laid everyone off, which they were able to blame on the pandemic and other reasons, but the timing was suspicious and I no longer drink their beer. Another example of how difficult it is to bring a union busting case, because there are many business reasons that an employer can point to as justification for their actions. So, if you're feeling like your employer does not have your best interests at heart, which they never do, and you're interested in organizing a union, and you go down that road, and then you feel that your employer is treating you differently because of your union organization, that could be a violation of the NLRA. If you think your NLRA rights have been violated, you can file a charge against your employer through the National Labor Relations Board. They have a whole slew of fillable forms, including Form NLRB 501, called Charge Against Employer, which is a fillable form where you just put in all your information and submit it to the NLRB, and then they'll investigate. Please note, though, that the NLRB receives 20,000 to 30,000 charges per year from employees, unions, and employers, and every charge is investigated. Once the board investigates, the findings are then evaluated by the regional director, and if it's significant enough, it'll then be reviewed by NLRB attorneys. And it typically takes 7 to 14 weeks for a decision to be made about the merits of a charge, though it can take longer. At this point, many of the charges are already settled by the parties or withdrawn or dismissed. If the NLRB does find sufficient evidence to support a charge, then they try to facilitate a settlement between the parties. If that can't be done, the agency then issues a complaint which then leads to a hearing before the NLRB administrative law judge. The NLRB represents the charging party, so you in this case, if you're an employee filing this, throughout settlement discussions and also the process before the administrative law judge. Please also note that it is illegal for an employer to retaliate against an employee for filing charges or participating in an NLRB investigation. If at the end of this process, the NLRB finds that there was a violation, they can't issue a monetary penalty. They can't fine the company. They can only reinstate and/or award back pay for discharged workers, and they can make the employer post a notice promising not to violate the law, amongst other things. However, if it's a gross violation, sometimes these cases can eventually wind their way through court and get to federal court, which could then lead to penalties for the company. But that is a long, drawn-out process that only a very tiny percentage of cases make it to, and most will settle before even making it before the administrative law judge. So why are people unionizing? Because we're once again at a place in this country's history where people are realizing the exploitative nature of capitalism. Yeah, sorry, I went there. And probably at unprecedented rates, thanks to the proliferation of information and stories via the internet, combined with the perspective that a global pandemic brought to our collective conscience about what really matters most in life. Hint, it's probably not your day job. Thanks again to my partner on today's video, Scentbird. Reminder to use my code Leeja at Scentbird to get 55% off your first month. Thanks, Scentbird. If you enjoyed this and want to support my work bringing you videos like this, please consider becoming a member of this channel or joining me over on Patreon, where we have a lively Discord chat, Leeja's book club, behind the scenes stuff, and so much more. Thank you especially to newest Patreon supporters Lisa and Molly Gore. And as always, thank you to my royal patrons Old Man Pence, Fork McSpoon, Ellen L, and Daniel Taylor. And a very special thank you to my multi-platinum patrons Brett Piontek and Cyrus Solka. Your generosity is greatly appreciated, and it makes this channel what it is, so thank you. If you like this video, you'll probably also like my last video where I answer the question, can you run for president from prison? Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.